A little over a year ago, I went on vacation to Tibet with my mother, and of course, you see the normal sites and the monasteries that you're meant to see. But in Lhasa, I had heard that there was a quarter of the city devoted to Muslim. And it was interesting to me that here on the roof of the world, there was a sizable Muslim population. So I decided to do some research into it. Called Kachi in Tibetan, these folks retain a unique and interesting culture, but remain mostly separate from the locals. So I had about a week to explore around the country and basically just a day to see this quarter of the city, and I wanted to tell you what I learned about it. Let's start with their history. In Tibetan, they're called Kachi Yul, which literally means Kashmir country. They first had a presence on the plateau in the 8th century with the advent of the Silk Road. What many don't realize about the Silk Road is that at its inception, it really was a set road, a single path that you followed from the Himalayas to Europe. This made it dangerous because highwaymen could easily ambush people that weren't traveling in caravans. It was like the Wild West, drawing outcasts that just wanted to get as far away from civilization as possible and would journey for hundreds of miles to hop off in the middle of nowhere. One of the earliest works on Tibet, written in 982 in Afghanistan, mentions that there was already a single mosque in the small Muslim community of Lhasa. There's also evidence for their introduction through warfare, similar to Tatars in Poland. During the 700s, there was a war in which Tibetans stretched as far as Kabul. A number of Arabs were captured and pressed into service on the Eastern Front, but eventually the Tibetan governor of Kabul became a Muslim in the early 800s, and it's reasonable to assume that some of the Muslims that were pressed into service simply remained in the country. It wasn't until the reign of the Dalai Lama Ngawang Gyatso in the 17th century that Muslims found recognition enshrined in law. They now had the blessing of the Buddhist government to have their own legal councils, settle disputes in Islamic courts, and basically worship completely openly. Clearly, early Muslims in Tibet came from many places. Ladakh, northern India, Kashmir, Afghanistan, but in subsequent wars and invasions brought a steady stream of Muslims up until the 1950 Chinese invasion. When this happened, they faced the same suppression of culture that their Buddhist brothers faced. We and ethnic Chinese migrated to Lhasa in Tibet, building over all but 6 or 7 buildings in Lhasa. Because the Chinese government classes Tibetan Muslims as Chinese Hui Muslims, their culture is dying because they have no official preservation. The Chinese build the area along the opposite side of the river up, clustering mainly close to the rail connection from Beijing, with movie theaters, food joints, and 5-star hotels. But their quarter of the city is surprisingly close to the center of the Buddhist quarter, and visiting it is pretty much a surprise. You walk through an alleyway to a mosque marked on a city map and see graffiti of a child crying on the walls. Immediately, the culture is different, where they're isolated to this part of the capital. In their quarter, they practice Islam, but there's no calls to prayer. They wear the Muslim skull cap, but I saw no burqas. They sell books in Arabic, but no Qurans. There's an open market for meat, but no pork. Finally, there's one last elephant in the room that the Free Tibet crowd likes to ignore. The Muslims are perceived by the ethnic Tibetan nationalists as collaborators with the ethnic Chinese, likely because of the influence of Chinese Hui Muslims and the Tibetan association of their would-be brothers with them. Lhasa's mosques were burned down in the 2008 unrest, in which thousands of protesters were disappeared by the army. You can't really talk about Tibet in a strictly apolitical context. The Chinese government regulates all issues of race, language, and religion through official departments and through the context of tourism. Although that's not honestly that different from Japan's very late recognition of racially distinct groups of people like the Ainu culture, or the fact that American Indian tribes died out because Americans really saw no difference between two different tribes. The marked distinction here is the abuses of human rights in the name of unity. So what's the point in talking about Tibetan Kachin Muslims and the political situation surrounding them? Well, Beijing pursues a policy of cut and paste tourists from one Tibetan Buddhist monastery to another, interspaced with some natural beauty, Mount Everest and some glaciers and mountains. Because of this really simple approach to marketing the country's culture for tourism, the Chinese government ignores unique cultures with its smaller interests. The long and short of it is that there just isn't much interest in Tibetan Muslims. They're not seen as beneficial to the Chinese economy, so they're not marketed for tours. Officially, China has declared them Hui Muslims, although they've been in Tibet for much longer than the Hui and have a culture virtually the same as Tibetans. As a consequence, the Chinese don't commonly show their culture as a part of any package tours. Let me give a description of how the average tour goes to better explain the political side of it. Prior to 2008, Western tourists could explore at will, meeting locals and driving to villages well off the beaten track. During the suppression of the riots, only Chinese companies could show Western tourists around, completely eliminating the chance for Westerners to encounter any kind of suppression of culture. This is so widespread that it can be seen just walking around a corner. I walked down an alleyway in Lhasa and witnessed Chinese riot police with guns just kind of inviting themselves into people's homes. Some of the most jarring things I saw was the central monastery, which they circumnambulate because it's the most holy monastery in the country. They believe in going clockwise, while Chinese police will walk around counterclockwise in uniforms with AK-47s and people grabbers, literally like little claws, but human size, to snatch somebody. There's ID checkpoints everywhere, and it's insane, especially during the Dalai Lama's birthday, where they had signs up on all the monasteries that said "Stay alert." I was even told by a Chinese American in my hotel that every time I leave my room, someone would come in and check the camera and laptop if I left it. Unfortunately, though, you're going to either have to use Google image search or really just take a lot of what I say at face value, because I was warned by my guide that having any photos with military members in it would get me in a lot of trouble. And I was also told that there was a very good chance that I was going to have my camera searched. After 2008, the Chinese made a compromise. Tibetan guide must accompany, but only on government-approved tours. We must be followed by an ethnic Chinese driver. And this is the extent of information in Tibet. Tours are very, very sheltered. Surprisingly, the Muslim community still has a very thriving but suppressed culture. Even a quarter of the city is devoted for their religious practice. But ethnic tension has driven a wedge between them and the local Tibetans. In a future video, I'll discuss the political situation for Tibetans in greater detail, but I was just excited to tell the story of an underreported and underrepresented culture of Muslims in Lhasa.